Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Mark Bain, Chair of the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships and partner at Tory's.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Day 2 of the 25th Annual CCPPP Conference. I trust everyone is well rested and recovered after our terrific night at the aquarium last evening. And for those of you who went on to the Young Leaders in Infrastructure event afterwards, I have some healthy skepticism you're less well rested. It was a great way to end up Day 1, which was jam-packed with great content and networking opportunities of the sort we've come to expect at the conference. On your chairs this morning, you'll find a couple of pieces. The Media Planet's infrastructure insert that appeared in the National Post in September, and Lexpert, which was published in the Reported Business in August. You'll find them to be insightful overviews of Canada's major infrastructure market and projects. I want to thank Jetro Toronto and Norton Rose Fulbright Canada for sponsoring this morning's breakfast to make sure we're all well nourished to take on another very excellent and busy day we have in store for you. That includes 3 keynote sessions you'll not want to miss and a host of sessions that will focus on international P3 opportunities. We'll get an in-depth briefing on Ontario's high-speed rail plans and how to connect complex transit systems and delivery models. And Denton's is sponsoring our afternoon session devoted to Canada's new infrastructure frontier and the role that the newly established Canada Infrastructure Bank will play. We'll begin with our Urban Infrastructure Super Session featuring Canada's Minister of Infrastructure and Communities, Amarjeet Sohi, and Toronto Mayor John Tory. Immediately after this session, we'll be opening the Toronto Stock Exchange live from this room right over there, and it will be broadcast live nationally by BNN. We'll be doing that with your help. We want as many of you as possible to be in the live camera shot, so we'll require your attention and enthusiasm when called upon. Mark Romoff will be the ringleader, and he'll run you through the paces, so be ready for the close-up. And so, without further ado, it's my pleasure to call up Danny Jacamel, Vice President of Ellisdown Capital, who is sponsoring our first session of the day. Danny.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good morning, everybody. And I'd like to say that Ellisdown is certainly very pleased to be sponsoring this morning's keynote panel, the Urban Infrastructure Super Session. And as Mark mentioned, the kickoff session features the Honourable Amarjeet Sohi, Canada's Minister of Infrastructure and Communities, and His Worship John Tory, Mayor of Toronto. This session will highlight the pressing need to deliver infrastructure that is resilient, robust in its life cycle requirements, and interconnected through digital networks. Most of all, it's got to be done with the smallest possible carbon footprint. The next phase of urban infrastructure is going to certainly drive the growth in future generations, ensuring that Canada is in a leadership position as our economy shifts from resources to resourcefulness. So today our moderator will be Elyse, Allan, President and CEO of GE Canada, and Vice President GE. Elyse leads GE's growth, investments, and business activities in Canada across its power, renewables, oil and gas, transportation, aviation, healthcare, and digital portfolio. The Women's Executive Network recognized Elyse as a top 100 women and Hall of Fame inductee. Both Maclean's and Canadian Business Magazine identified her as one of Canada's most influential business leaders. And in 2014, Elyse was appointed member of the Order of Canada. So please join me in welcoming Elyse, Allan, Minister Sohi, and Mayor Tory.
Good morning, how are you? Sounds like you had a great time last night. And I am sure a very productive session all day yesterday. I'm delighted to lead the panel. We'll start off by having a few remarks from Minister Sohi, and just give me a few moments to introduce him to you. The Honourable Amarjeet Sohi is the Member of Parliament for Edmonton, Mill Woods, and as you well know, he is the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities. Prior to being elected Member of Parliament, Minister Sohi was a 3-term Edmonton City Councillor. And this experience, no surprise, taught him the importance of infrastructure as the foundation for citizens to create strong, sustainable, and inclusive communities. Dedicated to improving Edmonton's infrastructure and livability, Minister Sohi represented the city on the Canadian Urban Transit Association and strongly advocated for light rail transit. He also brought forward his passion for inclusive city building through his representation at the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association and in leading City Council's immigration, multiculturalism, and racism-free Edmonton initiatives. Since assuming the Infrastructure and Communities portfolio, Minister Sohi has overseen the design and early implementation of more than a $180 billion plan over 12 years. It's the largest infrastructure investment plan in Canada's history. This plan invests unprecedented amounts in public transit, green infrastructure, clean water and wastewater, affordable housing, trade-enabling infrastructure, rural and northern communities, and much more. Minister Sohi has received several awards in recognition of his community leadership, and he lives in Edmonton with his wife and daughter. Minister Sohi, if you would, your 10 minutes. Sure, why don't you?
Well, thank you, Elyse. First of all, I want to thank each and every one of you for inviting me once again to be at your conference. It's always pleasure to join and discuss the importance of innovation in infrastructure and how innovation is applied to building strong, sustainable, and welcoming, inclusive communities. And it's always as well honored to be sharing this stage with my good friend and a partner, the Mayor of Toronto, Mayor John Tory. I must tell you that since being elected to this office as Member of Parliament and being appointed by the Prime Minister to be leading infrastructure and communities portfolio, I came to know John Tory and the work we have done together, and it's really a remarkable partnership and demonstrates that when all orders of government come together, we can do good things for our communities where we can achieve a lot. So thank you, Mayor Tory, for your leadership as well. I want to congratulate all of you on the 25th anniversary as an organization. It has been my pleasure to be here for almost since I got appointed to this position. I've been coming to your conference every year, and depending on how I do today, I'm looking forward to coming back next time as well. We'll see. But in all seriousness, your leadership as an organization has played a key role in making Canada a world leader in P3s. And I mean it, because I have been traveling to other countries. Whenever people talk about P3s, they talk about Canada, and they talk about your leadership and the work you have done to really make P3s integral part of the procurement process in Canada. So you're the effective way you leverage the expertise and of the private sector in designing, planning, and maintenance of infrastructure. We have seen great successes with the growth of P3 market in Canada here, with approximately 250 P3 projects underway across the country. P3 approach has become commonplace across Canadian jurisdictions. Through federal support, we are using P3 procurements to build bridges like the Gordie Howe International Bridge and the Champlain Bridge in Montreal. As well as we are using P3s in public transit infrastructure in my own city of Edmonton and other communities, and for water infrastructure projects in communities like St. John's. These projects are a small sample of how P3s are supported and how federal government over the last number of years has been using P3s for procurement. So in this spirit, Government of Canada remains committed to partnering with the private sector to build more infrastructure in Canadian communities. The creation of the Canada Infrastructure Bank is a new and optional tool for our partners to do just that, along with using P3s. The Canada Infrastructure Bank will invest in projects that generate revenue and are in the public interest, bringing private capital and institutional investors to the table. By leveraging private sector investments, we make public funds go further. When our government took office first in 2015, we committed to finding new and innovative ways to delivering infrastructure under our long-term Investing in Canada plan. The creation of the Canada Infrastructure Bank is one of those innovative ways. Another innovation we are launching is the Smart Cities Challenge. It is another great example how Government of Canada is encouraging innovation. The upcoming launch of this challenge will call on communities, large and small, to work with private sector and non-profit sectors and the research community to identify their own priorities, set their own goals, and come up with bold ideas to improve the lives of the residents. The sky is the limit when it comes to Smart Cities Challenge. So please keep your eyes and ears open as we launch the furthest next stage of this plan. Our overall goal as a government has been to create long-term growth, build inclusive communities, and support low-carbon and green economy. We are doing that by investing in 5 key areas: public transit, green infrastructure, social infrastructure, trade and transportation infrastructure, and rural and northern communities infrastructure. So this summer, I wrote to my provincial and territorial counterparts to begin the discussions around the next stage of plan, which is our next 10-year plan. One thing that we have heard from our partners, including municipalities, is that they need predictability, they need long-term and sustainable funding, and that's exactly what we are focused on delivering through our long-term plan in discussions in partnership with the provinces. So I look forward to those discussions. I look forward to today's discussion as well. So with that, I'm going to stop here, and we'll go into the to hear from Mayor Tory. Then we'll get into the discussion. Thank you so much for once again asking me to come and join you, and thank you so much for your partnership in helping build public infrastructure through which we help build welcoming, sustainable, and inclusive communities where we all proud to live in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister, and it's great to hear about the innovation that's coming from the government in this area. I'm now delighted to introduce the 65th Mayor of Toronto, John Tory, who has led the way in tackling traffic congestion, building transit, and so many other infrastructure challenges. Mayor Toronto has taken action to reduce commute times while moving forward with Toronto's first ever network transit plan. And that will see subway lines extended through the northwest end of the city into Vaughan and east to Scarborough, a significant expansion of the LRT network, and much greater use of GO lines across the city as part of Smart Track, the Mayor's signature transit initiative. Since being elected to office in 2014, the Mayor has been focused on ensuring Toronto remains a livable and affordable city, leading City Council in passing successive budgets that kept taxes at or below the rate of inflation while investing in priority services, including housing, parks, and student nutrition. He has worked to make the city government more modern and effective, to deliver better services at a more competitive price, and to be more open and accountable to the public. We look forward to hearing from Mayor Tory. Welcome.
Well, Elyse, thank you. And Minister, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, one and all. And again, I want to begin, as the Minister did, by saying thank you on a couple of accounts. First of all, to the Minister. I will just tell you that I think one of the things that often has been missing in this country, where we have lots of government in a relatively small country, is the ability of those governments to work together. And starting with the Government of Canada and starting with the Prime Minister, but in particular with this Minister of Infrastructure, I've been around, I haven't been elected for all that long, but I've been around the political process for a long time, and I've rarely seen the kind of partnership that we've seen from this Minister and from this government. And it extends, for example, and I'll be selfish a bit in talking about Toronto's interests. I mean, this is by far the biggest and most complex city in the country. And so if you look, for example, at our transit ridership, at 1.7 million transit riders per day, there is no city that even approaches that in terms of the numbers and the scale of that challenge. And what this government has done that others haven't, and it causes a degree of controversy, including perhaps with some of you from other parts of the country, but it recognizes the scale of what we have to deal with here. And a lot of the funding in the first phase of the transit funding announcements that he was referring to were made on the basis of ridership, which did something that we thought was necessary and appropriate in the context of actually addressing real need. And so I want to just thank him for his leadership. And I'll say as well, I have been and will continue to be not a critic but a supporter of the infrastructure bank. I don't know exactly how it's going to work. I don't suppose there's anybody who does as yet because it's new. But I think that the idea of trying something new and trying a new way to foster these kinds of partnerships that this meeting is all about, and finding a different role or an additional role for government is a good thing, and it's going to be much needed going forward, just as I'm going to ask you at the conclusion of my remarks today to come forward to us with more ideas, because the bottom line, and I think it's really what's driven the partnership with the Government of Canada and with the private sector, is trying for a change to actually get things done and get things built and move forward on some of the things that are crucial priorities for the success of our cities and of our country. And so I think the Infrastructure Bank is something that is going to end up being a positive in the context of offering at least one more way in which we can get things done. Elyse made reference in the introduction to the Network Transit Plan, and we've been busy at work in Toronto, thanks in part to the federal funding. It's put a bit of a time constraint on us in order to move forward with an extensive array of cycling, pedestrian, and other forms of active transportation above and beyond the Network Transit Plan that she made reference to. And I think that we're taking some of the necessary first steps, prodded along by the need, most of all, but also by the availability of this money, to have, for the first time in the history of this city, an actual network transit plan that deals with all modes of transportation and actually has more than one project at a time kind of governance, which is what we had before. We oftentimes in the City of Toronto, notwithstanding a hugely growing need, would be focused on one project at a time, and quite frankly, debating it and redebating it and redeciding it and modifying it and changing it and back and reversing it. And now we're moving forward on a plan. And the challenge for me, quite frankly, in terms of the city end of this, is to stay the course and to make sure that the transit plan, which has been approved by the City Council, is the one that we move forward with, and that we move forward and actually get it built, as opposed to focusing as much as we have in the past on politics. And transit is not the only place where we've had this partnership with the other governments. I'm pleased to tell you, especially those from outside of the city, that the three governments together are investing $1.5 billion in the flood protection at the mouth of the Don River. And it may sound, even to people who live here, well, why is that such a high priority? Well, the fact is that the largest undeveloped piece of real estate in an urban center in North America cannot be developed in an exciting way, including with transportation and other things, unless and until the flood protection work is done. And that is going to result in a fundamental transformation of a very important part of the city, and it represents one of the biggest opportunities anywhere in North America. But we're still left, at the end of the day, notwithstanding all of this good news, with $30 billion in unfunded capital infrastructure projects, ranging from parts of the very transit expansion plan I referred to, through to long-term care facilities to recreation centers, and frankly, addressing that deficit, addressing that unfunded account, is going to be fundamental to our success going forward. We are lucky to have a rapidly growing city here. We're lucky to have a city that is right now the focus of a lot of attention globally, not just in technology, but in a host of areas, including technology. We are seen as the innovation center and the financial capital of Canada, and in that sense, it attracts positive attention. Our way of life is something that is seen and admired by people in the rest of the country, but it is not going to preserve itself the way of life, the excellence and livability of the city. What a source of pride for Canadians generally to have in the list of the top 5 most livable cities in the world, 3 of them being Canadian. And so it indicates we have something right, and I think most of that relates to the underlying values that Canadians share. But my challenge, I always say, and I believe that would be true of the other mayors who are on the livable cities list, and anywhere in Canada for that matter, is to make sure 25 years from now that our cities are still on the list of most livable in the world. And that is going to require, in our case here, speaking of that, for us to actually address the $30 billion in unfunded infrastructure projects. Because, to be candid, that list has accumulated over time where governments of various stripes at various times, including at City Hall, but elsewhere also, have just said, well, we'll leave that for another day. And I will say in the case of City Hall that we have been very good at approving the development that you see around you as you visit the city. It's almost impossible to visit on a monthly basis and not see changes to the skyline, which are positive in the confidence that they represent in the city. But at the same time, up until now, we have put aside and sometimes postponed the investments that have to be made in the parks, in the schools, in the transit, in the recreational library facilities, in long-term care, and the list goes on of things that we have to invest in order to move forward. And I guess I don't draw a line between the two. It is not possible to change the way in which people live in a big global city like Toronto, where they're living more vertically in high-rise buildings, including families, without saying that you need to accompany that with parkland and recreational facilities and transit and the things that go with the change in the way that our cities are being put together. And I think that people who are looking to invest here understand that as well. I had 2 leading people from Silicon Valley here visiting last week, and I can tell you that they were looking at the prospect of locating second offices in North America outside of Silicon Valley in other places on the continent. And their first series of questions for the first 15 or 20 minutes of our meeting were not about our high-tech talent pool, they were about housing. They were about the availability of affordable housing for the people that they would want to work for their enterprises were they to locate in Toronto. And we have decided to go the route as well of when we're trying to attract jobs here, which we're trying to do constantly, as I hope other Canadian cities are doing as well, because we've got all the right stuff for them, of not offering huge tax incentives that we frankly can't afford and that become difficult to replicate when the next company and the next company come along, but rather saying to them the whole package of what we offer here, our talent plus the livability of our cities and those kinds of things are what we have to offer. And indeed, when you look at the Amazon RFP, it was fascinating to note that while, yes, there was some mention of financial incentives, there was as much attention paid to the planning of the cities, the livability of the cities, the availability of public transportation and airports and things like that as there was to the financial incentives. And so I will simply conclude by saying to you that we have here in this city a huge opportunity for you. We have, it's interesting, when I go to a lot of, and I don't go to a lot, when I go to some of these mayors' meetings, at everyone without exception, our expertise in private-public partnerships and working together to get things done is recognized. And I'll pay particular tribute to Infrastructure Ontario in that regard because they're respected and known globally. Our pension funds are known globally. If there's a frustration for me, it is in the fact that when I go to India, there was an article in the Indian newspapers when I was there 6 or 8 months ago extolling all the investments that have been made by our pension funds in India. When I was similarly in China, our pension funds and big pools of wealth are known. We haven't yet been successful, and I don't assess the blame, but I share it, in making sure that we have presented things of a scale and of a nature that would attract that kind of same investment and partnership from those same pools of wealth where they're resident and where the money comes from. And so I will just say to you that I need you to be involved. If you have an ingenious way, and I came from the private sector, both as a lawyer and as a business person, and I saw for myself the ingenuity that would come with financing of different kinds of ideas and initiatives. And if you have a way in which we can produce more affordable housing that goes beyond just saying, well, if you give us more density, we'll do more, or if you give us a bigger subsidy, we'll do more. If you have an ingenious way in which we can put the ingenuity and the finances and the expertise of the private sector to work on the need for us to create more affordable housing, and it's an urgent need, then I want to hear about it. Similarly with transportation and transit projects. If you have a way in which we can have a partnership to get those things done, which is my ultimate objective, and to put Canadian money to work in Canada on these projects which are necessary to fuel our future success so that we can keep having the enterprises here that many of you are part of, then I want to hear about that. I am interested in getting things done as the Mayor of Toronto, and that includes consideration of the real cost of not getting things done, because oftentimes when you talk about these partnerships, there is some risk transfer that carries with it some increase in the cost up front of those projects. But I'm interested in talking about these things because I'm most interested in getting things done. I want your help in getting things done, from railways to Rail Deck Park, which, and again, a big park like that has been proven in New York and Chicago to be done in a partnership with the private sector that I am not afraid of, but I welcome it as an opportunity. And I say the same thing with respect to housing, that we need to have your partnership in doing that. And so I would urge you to be proactive as investment bankers and financiers often are. Bring proposals forward. If they aren't ones that work, that's fine. We'll have a discussion, but inevitably, as you know, it might lead to an idea that does work. But if there isn't the flow of ideas coming to us to say, would you be interested in this, then we obviously can't proceed with it. So I just leave that message with you as it relates to the City of Toronto, and as we try and address that challenge of making sure we build the livable city of the future that will in turn be very important to our economic success as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mayor. Great discussion and starting point for our armchair discussion. So we have about 15 minutes or so just to ask a few questions and have a little bit of a discussion here. It's so nice to have two members of different levels of government sitting together, and I don't have to be in the middle, and this is good. So why don't I start with you, Minister Sohi? Yeah. You're now halfway through your mandate as government, and you're moving into phase 2 of this long-term infrastructure plan that you teased us a little bit about and spoke to in the 5 areas. Yeah. Maybe you could give us a bit more of an update as to where you are at and how you see sort of things upcoming, what are the upcoming discussions happening with the provinces and the territories?
So when we were launching the infrastructure plan, we engaged very extensively with the provinces and municipalities and other partners to understand where were the immediate needs were and how we also need to have a kind of long-term vision for infrastructure. So we decided to do it in 2 phases. Phase 1, which was launched in Budget 2016, focused on rehabilitation of the existing infrastructure. So repair what we have, optimize what we have, but also allow flexibility for municipality to use some of the funding from Budget 2016 to do the planning work and design work for large-scale infrastructure projects. So vast majority of the funding has been already allocated to projects. Since taking office, my department alone we have approved close to 4,000 projects with a combined investment of provincial, federal, and municipal, close to $35 billion, building better public transit systems, buying more buses. With that investment, close to 900 old buses are being replaced with new buses. More capacity is being added to public transit system. Hundreds of wastewater systems are being upgraded to make sure that every community has a safe, clean water to drink. It is unacceptable in today's day and age that we have communities in Canada that can't have safe water to drink, and we are trying to change that. Thousands of the affordable housing units are being renovated that needed major necessary repairs. So all those investments are making a real and tangible difference to improve people's lives. Because at the end of the day, whatever Mayor Tory is doing or our government is doing or province is doing, it is to make people's life better. It is to improve people's quality of life. And that's exactly what we have been doing through phase 1 investments. Now we are launching the phase 2 investment focused on the same outcomes, creating jobs for Canadians, economic growth, making sure our economy is more productive and efficient, moving to our low carbon green economy, and making people's lives easier by reducing their commute time, having affordable housing place to affordable place to live, or having recreational, cultural infrastructure where people can go work out, exercise, and connect with the community and build that cohesive relationship with within the neighborhoods they live. So that's where we are now.
Yeah, terrific. Well, it's been great progress so far, and I think we're pleased to see that and to see the cooperation, because so oftentimes the infrastructure projects don't move as much as we'd like, and we're seeing that movement now, which is terrific. Mayor Tory, you gave us such a great overview of what you're doing, but we'd love to maybe give you an opportunity just to elaborate a little bit more on what's happening, to the priorities, or where you see the priorities for the long term. Certainly you spoke about public transit, and maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on where you see the opportunity for the application of P3. I think it was a great plea for hearing from the marketplace as to what they think can do, but if you were to maybe set some priorities forth, where would you like the audience to think about areas first?
Well, thank you, Elyse. Let me narrow down out of that network transit plan the one that probably has the fastest and most obvious way, taking the ingenuity of this room into account, of the network transit plan. The network transit plan consists of the Smart Track, which is the use of GO transit rails through the city, and that's well underway, and the financing for that is largely in place. It depends on a degree of tax increment financing, in other words, development around the stations and so on for its success, but I'm confident that will be there. It consists of the Relief Line, which is a major project that provides some degree of relief for the Yonge Street Transit, and it includes the Eglinton East LRT, which will provide Scarborough neighborhoods and the University of Toronto Scarborough campus, which, by the way, today is a major university campus. It's a satellite campus, or whatever you want to call it, of the U of T, but it has itself 15,000 students, so it's a major place that is underserved by transit. But the one I want to focus on for 1 minute is the waterfront transit. And if you look at the waterfront and what's even happened today, leave alone what's going to happen with the Portlands. What you've seen today as Waterfront Toronto, which again is a partnership between the three governments, has developed the Chorus Building and George Brown College, and you have the sidewalk investment and partnership that is just recently announced involving Google. You have people like Tridel and Menkes who are down there with projects that are underway now. Again, what we're doing is we're developing the waterfront in a very responsible way, a very sustainable way, a very exciting and innovative way, but we're doing it at the moment without public transit properly servicing it. And so I want to keep up, as I said, I want to be consistent with what I said and make sure that the waterfront transit is something that is there coincident with a lot of the development, not 20 years later. And so I would say to you, if you think about it for a moment, and all the people that I mentioned, and I've left some off the list inadvertently, but Tridel and Menkes and Chorus and Sidewalk, Google, and so on, they're all down there in partnerships with us now. What a ripe opportunity there is to do something different, or at least to think about a different way to get that transit line, the waterfront LRT, underway now, as opposed to sort of waiting around. And it is one of the projects that the Phase 2 of the Government of Canada money is supporting, and we haven't yet heard from the Government of Ontario on it, but I'm saying we're in that phase now where we've been so often in the past where we've been waiting for some government or other to step up and be part of it, and I'm saying, well, that's fine, but maybe people in this room can step up and say, we have an idea as to how we can move that forward in terms of the financing, because normally that's the biggest impediment that stands in the way of getting it done, is how's it going to get paid for. And that's the kind of thing where I'm very eager and anxious to listen to ideas that people have that can form partnerships out of all those people who are already down there investing and others who are in this room to actually make that happen faster.
No, that's terrific. And it's great to have something specific that I think we can all focus on, especially when there's so much work going on around it. That's been so positive. Yeah. Minister Sohi, maybe I could just follow up with you a little bit on the Smart Cities Challenge. Yep. It was mentioned in Budget 2017. For those of you that don't know, we announced a Smart Cities Challenge, and I don't know how much you can give us right now, but it would be great if we could get a bit of an update on what the intent of the challenge is, why it's important that communities create sort of smarter, innovative infrastructure, how you're thinking about that, and maybe what you see in terms of next steps and timing of that initiative.
So the idea behind the Smart Cities Challenge is that how do we use technology and how we use data and combine them together to solve problems, right? Mm-hmm. That's what it is. We engage with the American cities and some other cities that have been launching this challenge. One of the winners in the U.S. was a city where they used autonomous vehicles concept and public transit and linking that with neighborhoods where infant mortality rate was almost 4 times higher. And with the use of that technology and data, they were able to improve services, and they reduced the infant mortality rate by 4 times, right? Wow. Yeah, so just imagine data technology and saving lives, right? Wow. I think there's so much potential that we have by using technology and data to improve people's lives, whether it's sensors to detect movement of traffic to reduce congestion, whether having smart technology that allows you to see when your bus is going to arrive, right? Whether it's using technologies to improve healthcare service. We are not going to define what a smart city should look like. What we want to do is make sure the ideas out there allow municipalities to work with their local organizations, nonprofit sector, private sector, and everyone else within the community, and come up with an idea. Then we will give some seed funding for the idea to develop into something actionable. And that's exactly what we are. That's exactly what our idea for the Smart City Challenge is.
Well, when you look at what's happening with digitization, right, in all aspects of work, we don't even know where it's going to go. So part of it is just also enabling the cities to absorb the innovation that's going to come down the pipe. So how do we just make sure that they're censored and they're able to be censored, yeah, right? And how do you enable it to happen? But it's very exciting. And I think as the world's going more towards cities, right, large cities everywhere, the opportunity for us to create.
So there are five challenges, yeah, and the 5 awards in the Smart City Challenge. Largest award is for big cities. Yeah. That's $50 million that we will provide, federal funding. We are not asking them to match. We are not asking provinces to match, because we understand that if we want to really foster innovation, we need to remove the financial barriers, because sometimes finding money becomes a challenge. So we will provide the funding. And the second challenge award was 2 awards for mid-size cities up to $10 million each. Then 1 award for small communities of $5 million, and 1 dedicated award for indigenous communities of $5 million. So we want it to be inclusive. We want to make sure that every community is able to participate.
Terrific. Great. Well, thank you for that. We seem to be on a roll in Toronto around, some smart city space and new initiatives. You've just partnered with Sidewalk Labs, and I think who we know, I think apparently is on the agenda later today, and I think also speaking at the Board of Trade dinner coming up in January. But I thought maybe you could explain to the audience a little bit about that initiative. What's the strategy that the city is pursuing? We'd love to hear about it.
Well, let me first explain what it isn't, because there's been various commentary that goes on with these kinds of things. And it resulted out of a competition that the Waterfront Corporation initiated about a 13-acre piece of land on the waterfront, and how we could attract there somebody who could be the partner with the Waterfront Corporation and probably others to develop something that really focused on the kind of innovation the minister was talking about in terms of how you could put together technology and transportation and housing and find better and newer and cheaper and faster ways to do things to build a community, as they put it, from the internet up, using technology, among other things. It has been portrayed as some kind of real estate thing, or that it involves in some way the larger area of the Portlands, which is 450 acres immediately to the east and the south, and that's not what it is. It's about this one piece of land, and I'm not trying to minimize the importance of it, because what happened when we had the competition was that, coincident with that, Sidewalk, Google were looking at a place in the world where they felt they could go and have trying to think of the right word now, the acceptance of the use of technology and data and the talented people necessary to be able to prove out various things that weren't really being done anywhere else in the world in terms of urban innovation. And they had picked Toronto almost on an independent basis, so that when this RFP came out, they bid on it. And the idea is to take a look then at different ways in which you can deliver transportation services using technology and data to help you with that. Different ways in which you can even build housing and even produce housing materials to allow you to build housing cheaper and faster when it comes to affordable housing of a high quality. And the idea here will be to do it in a holistic way that develops a new neighborhood, a new kind of core community in the downtown of Toronto that will put their innovation to work with our partnership and our talent and our city. to make that happen. And indeed, the objective, I think, for us all, for them and for us, is to have Canada become the center for global urban innovation, where people will come here from around the world to see what they've done here and what we've done here together. And that will be positive, I think, in a number of respects, not just in terms of urban living and what it does for Toronto in terms of a role model that can then be replicated elsewhere in our own cities in Canada, but also for the rest of the world. So that's what it is, and that's what it isn't, which is some other much bigger play. I mean, who knows what the lessons will be that come out of it in terms of benefiting the city as a whole, or the country, or the world. But the bottom line is it relates to this one area of land that we want to use as a kind of a demonstration project for how we can build the cities of the future from the internet up.
Any other comments about sort of cities of the future and how you're thinking about it for the city of
Well, I will only say this. I
Wanna
mean,
add?
people have heard me say this before. I mean, our city itself has a long way to go in terms of sort of walking the talk. I mean, I came in and found a place that was fueled entirely almost by pens and clipboards, which was nothing I was used to, having come from a company that was very advanced thanks to a founder that was always driving and pushing the envelope. And so we're trying to catch up on that now because, smart cities aren't just about how people get around and live their own lives. It's very much about that, but it's also about how the government serves them and how they interact with the government. And we have a long way to go on that, but we're basically taking it one function at a time and just going through and modernizing those, which involves digitization in many cases. Pretty simple stuff. I mean, I often say it, and I'm not afraid to say it. I think the government that I have a leadership role in today is probably 2 generations behind what I saw in the private sector in terms of the use of technology to provide more efficient and more customer-friendly and cheaper service to people through the use of technology. So we're working on that.
Yeah, great. Because, I mean, certainly we now have, the ability to do it, whereas before there were more limitations. But now all the pieces, the stars have aligned in order to digitize effectively and get good results at a low cost. Yeah. Terrific. Maybe a couple of questions are coming in, and one of the areas is the infrastructure bank, which you both commented on. Maybe I could start with you, Minister Sohi, just to give us your thoughts. I mean, given your municipal background, of course, I'm sure you can see a lot of ways the bank can be of assistance to municipalities. How are you thinking about it? And maybe, Mayor Tory, I'll ask
I'd rather answer that provocative Scarborough subway question.
The second one you want? Okay. Well, we'll start with the infrastructure bank.
Our government is making historic investments in infrastructure. We are tripling our investments from $60 billion to $180 and more $billion. And municipalities have their plans, and provinces have their plan. So, but despite all those investments, there will still remain a large amount of infrastructure deficit. Mayor talked about that, close to $30 billion in Toronto alone. So how do we bring private sector and public sector together to look at working together to solve that problem, to make a difference in reducing that infrastructure deficit? So you have infrastructure deficit on one hand, then you have pension funds, institutional investors that are looking for opportunities to invest in infrastructure to have a sustainable return over the long term, because infrastructure investments are very predictable and they give you a predictable rate of return. But we have pension funds that don't invest in Canadian infrastructure, but they do outside countries. So why would we not find a mechanism? So the creation of the bank is creating that mechanism where we can create this body that can engage with the private sector, identify public infrastructure projects that are in the public interest, then work together to build them and make the necessary infrastructure that needs to be built. So that is the idea. That is the concept.
Yeah, good.
And it has to be an organization that is kind of arm's length from the government's day-to-day decision, not being no intervention from the government. So it's a Crown Corporation. Will be run by independent board of directors, a CEO, and will make decisions on its own. The government's role is going to be earlier on identify if a particular project undertaken by the bank is in the public interest or not. Once that screen is applied, after that everything will be done by the experts at the bank to negotiate better deals, to do all the analysis and the viability assessment of that particular project. That's how we see it. But the goal is to bring pension funds, institutional investors, get them to invest in Canadian communities and build the infrastructure that otherwise may never get built, or we might have to wait maybe another 20, 30 years because the public sector dollars are limited or the projects are too large or complex by public sector to undertake.
Yeah, terrific. It's certainly an exciting initiative. Major, before you jump to the Scarborough subway question, do you want to comment at all on the bank? Or?
Just to say what I said at the podium, which is that, if we're going to have the ideas coming forward from the private sector generally and from the public sector, and if there's an opportunity to find a new way in which the Government of Canada, through the Infrastructure Bank, can participate in those, and especially if it's going to encourage our ability to put our resources to work that are at work in every other country in the world. I go into airports, or I read about airports and train projects and so on that are being financed by our pension plans. It makes me cry because we have the money here. They want to invest here. It's really the responsibility of us together in governments to present projects to these pools of wealth that are presented on a basis that makes it attractive for them to, and that they're big enough. And we have in Toronto, for sure, projects that are big enough on the transportation side and otherwise to attract this, and I think the Infrastructure Bank hopefully will help with that.
Very exciting. I mean, to the extent that it could provide a real step function in terms of how we move forward across the country. Do you want to be addressing that?
Well, I mean,
everyone else can't see it, but we can.
Well, you can read it to them if you want. I can just see it. So go ahead.
It disappeared. It's still there. It's the Scarborough subway project is in the news today, with Metrolinx indicating that the LRT option serves the community better. Is the plan still for a subway? Over to you.
Well, and the answer to the question is yes. And the reference in the newspaper is a 2013 report that was written, so that's almost 5 years ago now. And I guess I want to just say this for the people inside and outside, because I think it speaks to a process problem that governments have had in the past. Scarborough, for those who aren't from Toronto, is a part of the city that is a residence to 650,000 people and thousands of jobs, and it's dramatically underserved by higher order transit. And so if you look at all the other parts of the city, they are directly served by higher order transit, in this case subways. Etobicoke, North York, downtown are well served. And what you've had around each of the places where you've had the higher order transit service, the center of those parts of the city, is significant investment in jobs and in places to live. And so in the case of the Scarborough subway, first of all, it's not a subway that's just going from one block to another block in the middle of nowhere. It is an extension to an existing subway line to simply take it into the center of Scarborough, where the Scarborough Civic Centre and the Scarborough Town Centre are. And I'm absolutely convinced, based on what we've seen and what we've heard from people in the private sector who presently will talk about the lack of that transit as a disincentive to invest in Scarborough, that if we do that, we're going to have the kind of job growth and the kind of investment and the kind of residential development there that we have in other parts of the city. And I want to create an opportunity in Scarborough for people to do what they presently do in downtown Toronto. 40% of the people who live in the condos around this building walk to work every day. They walk to work. 20% of them don't even have driver's licenses. And that is the way we're going to have to think going forward in terms of cities that are, again, livable and functional. And this is a part of a network transit plan for Scarborough, the subway extension to the existing line. I mean, what is this notion that extending the subway is somehow wrong or some misguided notion? We've extended these subways before. We're extending one now. It's going to open in 3 weeks, financed in part by the Government of Canada. And so I just say to you that I have to take the long term. And by the way, I'll mention one more thing. We have had, I think, depending on whose count you believe, we will have another one today because it's in front of City Council again. We've had 11 votes approving this project. It's supported by all 3 levels of government. And I can only tell you that people will forever have some analysis. And that's why we're in some of the mess we're in Toronto today, because people just infinitely debated and voted on these projects and changed their mind. We're going to proceed with this project because it's a good long-term investment. Yes, it's expensive, but all transit is expensive, and we're going to proceed with it because we've had 11 votes and because in the long term it's the right thing to do.
Terrific. And absolutely. I think, as we say, you know, it's great to have the ideas, but it's the execution that ultimately matters, right? Is that we can get through with these things. Maybe in the 2 minutes that we have remaining, I'll give you each just a minute for any final remarks you'd like to make to the audience today. Minister?
The only thing I would say is that we're very pleased and proud that we are developing a 10-year plan to build public infrastructure. But it's the people in this room that make it happen. It's the people in this room that design those projects, you know, do the all the engineering, planning work, and they're the one, you're the one who build that infrastructure. So we cannot do what we do without your partnership, without your support. So I want to show my appreciation on behalf of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to all of you. Please continue to do the work you do, continue to build communities that we all desire to live in.
Thank you.
I'll just echo those words, Elyse. We have now, I think it's one of the first times I can speak in the case of Toronto, Ontario, and Canada, an alignment between three governments and the leaders of those governments who are working together well. And I want to say that everything I said about, and we've had a few bumps in the road with the province when it came to some of the funding for housing, and still a little bit of a question mark on the transit, but we're working well together. And this is something that in this country we often haven't seen before. We've been so consumed with these intergovernmental squabbles and different priority setting by different governments. And now I think the part that we need to really complete that and actually move forward to get things done, which is in the end what I think they expect of each of us and of the provincial government, is we need the ingenuity and the capital, but mostly the ingenuity of the private sector. As Amarjeet said, you are the ones that design and you build, and you have the new and better ways to do these things using technology and using your smarts. We don't have that, nor should we be trying to have that in government. And I'm just saying that my invitation earlier on, and I'm sure it has been echoed by the comments of this minister, and I'm sure by the provincial people if they were here as it relates to Toronto, is to please come forward with ideas. No matter how crazy you think they are, bring them forward and we can at least discuss them, and I'm convinced this will help us to get things done faster, which is what I think we have to do in order to make up for some decades of relative inaction when it comes to these fantastic cities we're so lucky to live in, that I think are a magnet for investment and jobs from around the world, but we've got to keep them that way and make sure people don't start to write us up negatively as strangling on our own growth. And so I'm just issuing that invitation again in partnership with my friend Amarjeet, and also with the other governments, but most importantly with you.
Gentlemen, you've both been incredibly generous with your time this morning. We appreciate the schedules you have, but most importantly, we thank you for the leadership that both of you are bringing to this great deficit that we have in our city and in our country, but you're bringing action to follow the ideas and the words, and we're most appreciative of your leadership in this area. Please join me in a warm welcome for Mayor Tory and Minister Sohi.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. Minister, thank you very much.